Welcome back to the channel. Today we're not just exploring history, we're stepping inside it. Close the door behind you, leave the modern world for a moment, and prepare to experience a place that was meant to heal, but often did something very different. In this episode, we drift into the shadowed corridors of the Victorian era to uncover what life was really like inside an asylum, the routines, the beliefs, and the realities that many never escaped. If you enjoy immersive history that brings the past to life, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us on this journey into the stories history rarely tells. Now, let's begin. Imagine waking up to a sound you don't recognize. Not an alarm clock, not the distant murmur of traffic or the comfort of voices in another room. This sound is heavier, metallic, final, the slow grinding of a key turning in a lock somewhere down a corridor. You open your eyes, expecting familiarity, expecting the ordinary shape of your room, the small assurances that tell you where you are and who you are. Instead, you see a ceiling too high above you, stained with age, its plaster cracked like dry earth. The air smells wrong, sharp with disinfectant, damp stone, and something older, something human that has lingered too long without fresh air to carry it away. For a moment you believe there has been some mistake. You sit up. The bed beneath you is narrow, harder than it should be, covered in coarse linen that scratches your skin when you move. There are no personal belongings nearby, no clock, no photographs, no evidence that you existed anywhere before this moment, only the echo of footsteps outside and the faint murmur of voices you cannot quite hear clearly enough to understand. You stand, instinctively searching for a door, because surely you can simply walk out and ask what is happening. But the door you find is thick, reinforced, with a small observation hatch set at eye level. It opens only from the outside. You try the handle anyway. It does not move, and then you realize something unsettling. You are not a guest here. You are contained. The Victorian age liked to imagine itself as enlightened. It was a time of invention, industry, expansion, railways stretching across landscapes, cities swelling with ambition, science promising answers to questions humanity had asked for centuries. There was a sense, among those who held power, that civilization was advancing toward reason and order. But woven quietly into that progress was another belief, one far less comforting, that anything which did not fit neatly into society's expectations needed to be removed from view. And so places like this were built. From the outside, a Victorian asylum could appear almost grand, imposing facades of brick and stone, symmetrical windows, landscaped grounds meant to suggest calm and structure. To passing observers, these institutions looked like monuments to care, to reform, to humanity's growing compassion for those who struggled with the mind's unseen afflictions. But architecture can lie. Inside, beauty gave way to something else entirely, a system not just of treatment, but of separation. The moment you cross the threshold, you pass from the world of the ordinary into a carefully controlled environment where time, behavior, even identity itself were regulated. You might not yet understand why you were brought here. In fact, many never truly did. There was rarely a dramatic declaration, no clear explanation offered with patience or empathy. Instead, there would have been a quiet process, documents signed, decisions made in rooms you never saw, conclusions reached without your voice present. Perhaps a relative believed they were acting in your best interest. Perhaps a doctor, armed with limited understanding and great authority, decided your behavior fell outside the acceptable boundaries of normal life. Once those decisions were made, they became reality. You begin to hear more sounds now. A distant cry quickly silenced. The rattle of a cart rolling across stone floors. Keys again. Always keys. They are the heartbeat of this place, constant reminders that movement, access, freedom all belong to someone else. A small panel in the door slides open. A pair of eyes glance in, assessing you not with curiosity but with routine efficiency. You are not being greeted. You are being checked. If you try to ask questions, you may receive answers, but they will not be the kind you want. You will be told to remain calm, to cooperate, to understand that everything being done is for your benefit. The words sound reassuring, but they carry an unmistakable message. Your interpretation of events is no longer considered reliable. This is one of the most disorienting aspects of entering such a place. Your own perception begins to lose authority. If you insist you are well, that insistence may itself be recorded as a symptom. If you express fear, it may be labeled agitation. If you demand release, it may be taken as proof you require further confinement. In a world like this, logic becomes a trap. Victorian society placed immense trust in institutions. Order was valued above nearly everything else, and asylums were seen as instruments of that order, spaces where chaos, as it was perceived, could be managed away from the public eye. Families were reassured that their loved ones would receive structure. Communities were comforted by the idea that troubling behavior had somewhere to go. The asylum stood as both a promise and a boundary. Here, difference would be handled. But the lived experience of that promise was far quieter, far more uncertain. As you are eventually led from your room, escorted by attendants whose expressions remain carefully neutral, you notice the corridor stretching far beyond what seems necessary. Doors line the walls at regular intervals, identical to your own. Some remain closed. Others are open just enough to reveal figures sitting inside, motionless, watchful, or turned inward as though retreating to some place beyond reach. No one rushes. Nothing feels spontaneous. Movement here follows patterns established long before your arrival. You are guided not with violence, but with firmness. There is a practiced quality to every gesture, as though the staff have learned that control works best when it appears calm. Raised voices are rare. Authority is conveyed through repetition, through rules, through the simple fact that there is nowhere else to go. The building itself begins to feel like an organism, vast, slow, and indifferent. Its walls absorb sound, its hallways disorient. Its scale reminds you constantly of your smallness within it. Even the light seems regulated, filtering through tall windows designed less for viewing the outside world than for illuminating the interior. You may search for warmth, for reassurance, for some sign that this is temporary. Yet nothing in the rhythm of the place suggests urgency about your departure. In the Victorian understanding of care, time functioned differently. There was no expectation of quick recovery, no structured plan leading clearly toward release. Instead, there was routine, the belief that regularity itself could reshape a person. Days repeated, bells marked transitions, activities were scheduled not to inspire, but to maintain order. Gradually, you would begin to notice how easily individuality faded under such conditions. Clothing might be standardized, personal choices minimized, conversations monitored. The small details that once defined you, what you liked, what you disliked, how you preferred to spend an hour alone, became irrelevant in an environment designed for groups, not individuals. And that is when the deeper unease would set in. Because the greatest shock of waking in a Victorian asylum was not the locked door, nor the strange bed, nor even the realization that you could not leave. It was the understanding that the world outside continued without you, entirely unchanged by your absence. Life went on. Streets filled, shops opened, families gathered for meals. Newspapers printed stories about progress and innovation and the marvels of the modern age. Meanwhile, behind these walls, your existence narrowed to a set of observations, entries in a ledger, decisions made by others about what you were, what you needed, and whether you might ever again be considered part of ordinary society. In that moment, standing in an unfamiliar corridor, surrounded by routines you did not choose, watched by people who believed they understood you better than you understood yourself, you would begin to grasp the true nature of this place. It was not merely a hospital. It was a boundary, a line drawn by an era determined to define normality and to place anyone who challenged that definition somewhere out of sight in the name of care, in the name of order, in the name of progress. And once you found yourself on the far side of that line, returning was far more uncertain than anyone outside cared to admit. One of the most unsettling truths about entering a Victorian asylum was that you did not have to be violently unstable, incoherent, or dangerous to be sent there. In fact, many people who found themselves behind those heavy doors had lived lives that, to modern eyes, would appear ordinary. They had families, responsibilities, worries, griefs, disagreements, and moments of emotional strain. Experiences that today would be recognized as part of the wide spectrum of being human. But in the 19th century, the boundary between acceptable behavior and supposed insanity was thin, shifting, and often defined not by medicine but by social expectations. To understand how easily someone could be committed, you have to step into a world that valued conformity above self-expression. Society was rigidly structured. There were clear ideas about how a person should behave, speak, dress, mourn, love, and even think. Any deviation from those expectations could be interpreted not as individuality, but as instability. If a person grieved too deeply after the death of a loved one, if they could not quickly return to their duties, if they lingered in sorrow longer than others thought appropriate, that grief might be described as melancholia. Today we would recognize depression, trauma, or complicated bereavement. Then it could become grounds for confinement. If someone suffered emotional exhaustion, what we might now call burnout, they could be labeled as having nervous weakness. If they withdrew from social life, they might be accused of unhealthy introspection. If they spoke passionately about injustice or religion or philosophy in ways others found uncomfortable, that intensity could be interpreted as mania. The definitions were not medical in the modern sense. They were moral judgments disguised as diagnoses. Women lived under particularly fragile protection from such accusations. The Victorian world believed firmly that a woman's role was to be calm, obedient, nurturing, and morally steady. If she stepped outside that narrow frame, even slightly, her behavior could be pathologized. A woman who resisted an unhappy marriage, argued with her husband, or expressed anger might be described as hysterical, a word used so broadly that it lost any clinical meaning and became a convenient explanation for almost any unwanted emotion. Postpartum depression, though unnamed at the time, was frequently misunderstood. A mother struggling after childbirth could be seen not as someone needing support, but as someone whose mind had become unbalanced. Rather than receiving care within her home, she might be removed from it entirely. Even education could become suspicious. Women who read extensively, wrote, or showed intellectual ambition were sometimes believed to be straining their fragile minds. Too much thinking, some claimed, could lead to madness. For men, the expectations were different but equally restrictive. A man was supposed to be rational, industrious, and self-controlled. Financial failure, public embarrassment, or emotional vulnerability could be interpreted as signs that he had lost mastery over himself. Alcoholism, now recognized as addiction, was seen as both a moral failing and evidence of mental collapse. Eccentricity, harmless in another era, could become dangerous in this one. Someone who dressed unusually, pursued unconventional interests, or simply refused to behave like their neighbors might attract scrutiny. Communities were smaller, reputations carried weight, and once suspicion began, it could grow quickly. What made the situation truly alarming was how little protection individuals had against such judgments. Commitment to an asylum often required only the certification of one or two doctors, sometimes accompanied by the request of a family member. There was rarely an adversarial process, no meaningful legal defense, no opportunity for the accused to challenge the claim. The assumption underlying the system was that authorities acted in the patient's best interest. But authority is not the same as accuracy. Medical understanding of the mind was still in its infancy. Physicians relied heavily on observation filtered through cultural beliefs. If a patient did not behave according to expected norms, that behavior was interpreted through a lens already primed to see illness. Once labeled, the label carried enormous weight. Imagine trying to defend yourself in such a system. You insist you are well, you explain your feelings, your frustrations, your reasons for acting as you did. But your explanations are written down not as testimony but as symptoms. Your attempt to argue your case becomes evidence of agitation. Your distress at being confined becomes emotional instability. Even calm denial might be recorded as delusional conviction of sanity. In this way, the process could become self-reinforcing. The more you resisted, the more the institution believed it had been correct to admit you. Families, too, played complicated roles. Some genuinely believed they were helping. Faced with behaviors they did not understand and lacking resources to provide care, they turned to asylums as the only option presented to them. Others, however, used the system in ways that blurred the line between concern and convenience. An elderly relative with memory problems might be sent away rather than cared for at home. A difficult marriage could be quietly resolved by removing one partner from the household. Property disputes, inheritance tensions, or social embarrassment could all intersect with the asylum system in ways that left the confined person powerless. There were, of course, patients who truly suffered severe mental illness, but they entered the same institutions as those whose primary crime was nonconformity. The asylum did not always distinguish carefully between them. The experience of arrival erased those distinctions even further. Clothing was exchanged for institutional garments. Personal items were catalogued and often removed. Routines replaced autonomy. Whether you had been a teacher, a laborer, a parent, or a writer mattered less than your new classification within the asylum structure. Language itself shifted. You were no longer described as a citizen or an individual. You became a case, a resident, a lunatic in the terminology of the time, a word used clinically then but carrying a weight that reduced identity to condition. And because Victorian society placed enormous faith in institutional authority, once someone was admitted, outsiders were inclined to believe the admission must have been justified. The very fact that you were there became proof that you belonged there. This created a quiet but devastating isolation. Letters sent outward might be delayed, monitored, or never delivered. Friends who considered visiting might hesitate, unsure how to interact with someone now labeled insane. Over time, connections frayed. Inside, you might meet others whose stories echoed your own, people confused about how they had arrived, still convinced that some explanation would resolve everything. But as weeks turned to months, hope often gave way to resignation. The tragedy lay not only in confinement, but in misunderstanding. Victorian culture feared what it could not categorize. Emotional pain, unconventional thought, resistance to rigid roles, these were not seen as variations of human experience, but as threats to social order. Asylum became a place where those perceived threats were gathered and hidden. Yet from the outside the narrative remained reassuring. These institutions were described as places of refuge, science, and moral guidance. Reports spoke of structured days, therapeutic environments, and the promise of restoration. The gap between that description and lived reality could be vast. To wake up inside such a system was to discover that the definition of sanity was not yours to control. It belonged to a network of expectations, authorities, and cultural anxieties that could, with alarming ease, redefine ordinary suffering as illness. And once that redefinition occurred, escaping it was far harder than entering it. Because in a world where difference itself could be diagnosed, almost anyone, given the wrong moment, the wrong observer, or the wrong circumstance, might find themselves standing on the threshold of an asylum, still believing they would soon explain the misunderstanding, only to realize that explanation was no longer enough. The moment you were brought fully inside, the building itself began to do its work on you. Long before any treatment, any conversation, any formal assessment, the architecture started shaping your experience. Victorian asylums were not designed casually. Every wall, every corridor, every window placement reflected a philosophy about control, observation, and separation. These places were meant to impose order, not just through rules, but through space itself. From the outside, many of these institutions looked almost reassuring, grand, symmetrical, even elegant. Their size suggested stability. Their grounds were often landscaped with trees, gardens, and pathways, as if to create an atmosphere of calm retreat. But that exterior presentation masked a very different internal reality. Once you crossed the threshold, the scale of the place became overwhelming. Corridors stretched far longer than seemed necessary, running in straight lines that appeared to vanish into shadow. The ceilings were high, amplifying footsteps into hollow echoes. Doors repeated at regular intervals, identical in shape and color, offering no visual cues to help you orient yourself. It was easy to lose any sense of direction within minutes. This was not accidental. Confusion made resistance more difficult. When every hallway looked the same, you depended entirely on those who already knew the layout. The building taught you very quickly that you could not navigate it alone. Windows were another carefully considered feature. They were often tall but placed high on the walls, allowing light to enter while limiting any view of the outside world. You could see the sky, perhaps, or the tops of trees, but rarely the road, the town, or any sign of ordinary life continuing beyond the grounds. The effect was subtle but powerful. You were reminded constantly that there was an outside, yet you were denied the details that might let you feel connected to it. Air flowed through large wards designed to house many patients at once. Privacy was scarce. Beds might be arranged in long rows separated by little more than narrow gaps. Personal space, something people rely on without thinking, became a luxury you no longer possessed. Even rest happened under observation. Observation was central to the asylum's design. Staff needed to see patients easily, to monitor behavior, to detect disturbances before they escalated. Open sightlines allowed attendants to scan entire rooms at a glance. Some doors included small viewing panels. Certain areas were arranged so that a single person standing in the right position could watch multiple corridors at once. To live in such a place was to grow accustomed to being watched, without always knowing when. Sound behaved differently inside these walls. Conversations carried. A distant shout might echo unexpectedly. At night, when activity quieted, the smallest noise, a cough, a creaking bed frame, the turning of a key, could feel magnified. Silence was rarely peaceful. It was tense, waiting, easily broken. Over time, this sensory environment began to shape behavior. People spoke more softly, moved more cautiously, avoided drawing attention. The building rewarded stillness and discouraged spontaneity. Patients were divided into wards based on classifications that reflected Victorian ideas about mental illness. The calm were separated from the agitated. Those considered curable were kept apart from those deemed chronic. Men and women lived in entirely different sections. Each category carried its own routines, restrictions, and expectations. Once assigned, moving between these categories was difficult. The label followed you physically, determining where you slept, where you walked, whom you interacted with. Even if your condition improved, or if you had never been ill to begin with, the structure around you reinforced the identity the institution had chosen. This separation extended beyond patients to the world itself. Asylums were often built at the edges of cities or deep in the countryside, deliberately removed from everyday activity. Distance served a practical function. It reduced the likelihood of escape and minimized disruption to surrounding communities. But it also created psychological isolation. Visitors had to make deliberate efforts to travel there. Casual contact with society disappeared. Inside, time began to feel detached from the outside world. Without familiar markers, work schedules, social gatherings, personal obligations, days blended together. The building supported this timelessness. Its repetitive design gave few visual clues to distinguish morning from afternoon, one day from the next. Even movement through the asylum followed strict pathways. Doors were locked and unlocked according to schedule. Certain staircases were reserved for staff. Patients were guided along specific routes, rarely allowed to wander freely. You might walk the same hallway dozens of times without ever seeing what lay beyond another door. Gradually, your world shrank to the spaces you were permitted to occupy. Furniture was functional, often heavy, sometimes fixed in place. Objects that could be broken or moved easily were avoided. This reduced the risk of harm, but it also removed opportunities for personalization. Rooms felt interchangeable, belonging more to the institution than to the people inside them. Light, too, was controlled. Large windows admitted daylight, yet artificial lighting in the evenings could be dim or uneven, casting long shadows. The atmosphere was rarely cozy. Instead, it remained formal, institutional, faintly austere. The intention behind such design was rooted in the belief that environment could discipline the mind. Victorian reformers argued that structured surroundings would encourage rational behavior. Cleanliness, order, and routine spaces were supposed to counteract what they saw as chaos within patients. But structure can become oppressive when it leaves no room for individuality. Imagine spending weeks in a place where every visual element reminds you that you are one of many, not a person with a distinct life beyond these walls. Imagine never choosing where to sit, when to step outside, or which direction to walk. Even small decisions, ones you once made unconsciously, are removed. The building becomes more than a setting. It becomes an authority. And because it is always present, always enclosing, it reinforces the idea that your confinement is permanent. Unlike a courtroom or an office, spaces you enter and leave, the asylum surrounds you continuously. There is no neutral ground within it. Patients often described feeling as though the structure itself pressed inward, not physically, but psychologically. Endless repetition of walls, sounds, and routines could dull the senses. Some grew withdrawn, others restless. Many experienced a slow erosion of confidence, as though the environment itself questioned their ability to function independently. This was one of the quiet paradoxes of the Victorian Asylum. It aimed to restore order to troubled minds, yet its very design could unsettle even those who arrived in good health. To wake each day inside such architecture was to confront the same message over and over: you are here because you are different, and here you will remain until told otherwise. There were gardens, in some institutions, where patients were marched for supervised walks. These outdoor areas were often enclosed, carefully measured, and visible from the building's windows. Even moments of fresh air occurred within boundaries. Freedom was simulated, not granted. Seasons changed beyond the walls. Leaves fell, snow gathered. Spring returned. But from within the regulated environment, those changes could feel distant, almost unreal, like scenes observed rather than lived. Over time, the building's influence deepened. New arrivals noticed its strangeness immediately, but long-term residents sometimes stopped seeing it altogether. The extraordinary became ordinary. The oppressive became familiar. That adaptation, more than any locked door, ensured control. Because once a person ceased expecting space, variety, or autonomy, the institution no longer needed to enforce those absences actively. The design had already done its work. In this way, the Victorian Asylum was not merely a place where people were kept. It was an environment carefully constructed to reshape perception of time, of self, of possibility, until the outside world felt less like a destination and more like a fading memory. If you remained inside long enough to grow accustomed to the building, The next force shaping your life would be routine. In a Victorian asylum, the day did not unfold according to personal needs, moods, or choices. It moved according to a strict schedule, repeated with such consistency that time itself seemed to lose flexibility. The intention behind this regimentation was rooted in a belief common to the era, that disorder of the mind could be corrected through order of the body. Structure, repetition, and discipline were thought to calm emotional disturbance and restore rational habits. But in practice, this system often prioritized obedience over healing. Your morning would begin not when you awoke naturally, but when the institution decided the day should start. A bell rang, loud, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. It echoed down corridors and through wards, summoning everyone at once. There was no gradual transition from sleep to wakefulness, no quiet moment to gather your thoughts. You rose because the sound demanded it. Attendants moved through the wards ensuring compliance. Some patients needed encouragement, others physical assistance, but the goal was always the same: everyone up, everyone moving, everyone following the same rhythm. Individual variation slowed the system, and the system did not slow. Washing came next, often in shared spaces. Privacy, as understood in ordinary life, did not exist here. Basins might line a wall, water cold or only slightly warmed, mirrors scarce or absent. Cleanliness was emphasized, not necessarily for comfort, but because Victorian institutions associated physical order with moral order. To be clean was to be disciplined. To be disciplined was to be improving. Clothing was distributed rather than chosen. Garments were practical, uniform, and durable, designed to withstand heavy use and repeated laundering. Personal style vanished. Dressed alike, patients became visually interchangeable, reinforcing the idea that they were part of a managed population rather than individuals with distinct identities. Breakfast followed, served at the same hour each day. Meals were plain: porridge, bread, perhaps tea, nutritious enough to sustain, but rarely varied. Dining halls could be large, echoing spaces where conversation was limited or discouraged. The act of eating became another scheduled function, efficient rather than social. Afterward came the core of the day, work. Victorian reformers called it therapeutic labor. They believed purposeful activity could redirect troubled thoughts and instill self-control. Idleness, they argued, allowed unhealthy reflection, while work anchored the mind in reality. This philosophy drew from broader social values that equated productivity with virtue. To work was to be useful was to be well. Yet the reality inside many asylums blurred the line between therapy and necessity. Institutions required enormous upkeep. Laundry had to be washed, meals prepared, floors scrubbed, gardens maintained, repairs completed. Employing large professional staffs would have been costly. Patient labor filled the gap. Men might be assigned to farming, carpentry, or hauling supplies. Women often worked in laundries, kitchens, or sewing rooms, mending clothing for the entire institution. These tasks were repetitive, physically demanding, and rarely optional. Participation was expected, framed as part of treatment whether or not it benefited the individual. Refusal to work could be interpreted as resistance. Resistance, within the logic of the asylum, suggested illness persisting or worsening. So reluctance itself became justification for increased supervision or discipline. Supervision was constant. Attendants monitored posture, pace, cooperation. The goal was not simply to complete tasks, but to perform them in a manner deemed orderly and calm. Sudden movements, emotional outbursts, or visible frustration might be noted in records, each observation contributing to an evolving assessment of your condition. Midday brought another meal, another bell, another transition executed collectively. There was little room for spontaneity. Even moments meant to resemble leisure, perhaps a walk in the grounds or time spent in a day room, occurred at fixed intervals under watchful eyes. Conversations among patients varied. Some formed quiet bonds, sharing fragments of their lives before confinement. Others withdrew entirely, worn down by monotony or uncertainty. The environment did not easily foster deep connection. Schedules kept people moving, and constant observation discouraged candid expression. Afternoons often meant a return to labor or structured activities intended to occupy attention. Reading, if allowed, might involve approved materials. Writing could be supervised. Creative expression was sometimes encouraged, but always within limits that maintained institutional control. What you began to notice, perhaps gradually, was that nothing in your day truly belonged to you. Even rest periods were prescribed. You sat because it was time to sit, not because you were tired. You walked because you were told to walk, not because you desired fresh air. The distinction between choice and compliance blurred until many actions felt automatic. This erosion of personal agency could have profound psychological effects. Modern understanding recognizes autonomy as central to well-being. The ability to make decisions, however small, reinforces identity and confidence. Inside the Victorian Asylum, autonomy was systematically reduced in favor of predictability. Evenings followed the same pattern. Supper arrived at its designated hour. Afterwards, patients might gather in common areas, but activities remained limited and closely monitored. Some institutions permitted music or supervised entertainment, believing gentle diversion beneficial. Others maintained stricter silence. As night approached, another bell signaled preparation for bed. The transition was swift. Beds arranged in rows once again emphasized collectivity over individuality. Lights were extinguished according to schedule, not personal readiness for sleep. Darkness settled, but true quiet rarely followed. The sounds of many people sharing space, breathing, shifting, murmuring, filled the room. Occasionally someone cried out, disoriented or distressed. Attendants responded, restoring order, ensuring the environment remained controlled. And then, after hours that might feel either endless or strangely compressed, the cycle prepared to begin again. Days repeated with such similarity that distinguishing one from another became difficult. Without variation, memory lost its usual markers. Weeks could pass without a single event standing out clearly. For some patients, this regularity did bring a measure of stability. Predictable structure can indeed comfort those overwhelmed by chaos. But for many others, especially those confined unjustly or indefinitely, the sameness became suffocating. Life reduced to routine risks becoming mechanical. When every action is dictated, the mind may cease to anticipate, to plan, to imagine alternatives. The future feels indistinguishable from the present. This was the paradox at the heart of daily life in the Victorian Asylum. The system intended to restore individuals to society by teaching discipline and order. Yet in removing choice and individuality, it sometimes distanced them further from the very independence they were meant to regain. Over time, obedience replaced initiative. Compliance replaced curiosity. The institution functioned smoothly, its schedules maintained, its wards orderly. But beneath that order, many lived in a state not of healing but of quiet endurance, moving from bell to bell, task to task, day to day, within a life carefully organized for them, yet no longer truly their own. Even if you managed to adapt to the routines, even if you learned when to stand, when to work, when to remain silent, there was another aspect of life inside a Victorian asylum that could be far more frightening than the loss of freedom or individuality. It was the treatment itself. These institutions believed they were practicing medicine. Doctors, attendants, and administrators often saw themselves as agents of progress, working within the limits of the knowledge available to them. But that knowledge was incomplete, shaped by theories that misunderstood the human mind, and by a cultural desire to correct behavior rather than understand it. To modern eyes, many of these treatments appear harsh, even cruel. At the time, they were often justified as necessary interventions meant to calm agitation, restore balance, or encourage rational thinking. The underlying assumption was that mental illness was something that could be subdued through physical means. If the body could be controlled, the mind, it was believed, would follow. One of the most common approaches involved restraint. Restraints came in many forms, some simple, others more elaborate. Leather straps might be used to secure a patient to a chair or bed if they were considered disruptive or at risk of harming themselves or others. There were devices designed to limit arm movement, preventing gestures that attendants interpreted as signs of distress or aggression. These measures were defended as protective, yet they could also become tools of convenience in overcrowded wards, where staff struggled to manage large numbers of people. Imagine the experience of being unable to move freely, not because you chose to rest, but because movement itself had been judged unsafe. Hours could pass in enforced stillness. Even when applied with the stated aim of calming the patient, such confinement often deepened feelings of helplessness. Isolation was another method widely used. Small rooms, sometimes called quiet rooms, were intended to remove overstimulation and give agitated individuals space to settle. In practice, these spaces could be stark and nearly empty, containing little more than a bed or even just padded walls. Light might be minimal, sound muffled. The idea was that solitude would soothe the mind, but for many, isolation produced the opposite effect. Without conversation, without distraction, time could stretch unbearably. Thoughts circled endlessly. The absence of human contact could intensify confusion rather than relieve it. Water treatments were also common, rooted in older medical traditions that viewed temperature and circulation as keys to regulating emotion. Patients might be subjected to cold baths, sometimes unexpectedly, under the belief that the shock would interrupt agitation or melancholy. In other cases, prolonged warm baths were prescribed, intended to relax the body and induce compliance. These experiences were rarely gentle. The suddenness of cold water, the loss of control over one's own body, the knowledge that such procedures could be repeated, all contributed to an atmosphere where treatment felt less like care and more like submission to an external force. Medications, too, reflected the limits of contemporary science. Sedatives derived from substances such as opiates or bromides were administered to quiet, restless patients. These drugs could dull awareness, slow reactions, and create a haze in which clear thinking became difficult. While they sometimes reduced outward signs of distress, they did not address underlying causes. Instead, they often left individuals exhausted, detached, or dependent. The Victorian medical model focused heavily on observable behavior. If a patient shouted, they were calmed. If they resisted, they were restrained. If they appeared withdrawn, they might be stimulated with activity. Yet little attention was given to personal history, trauma, or emotional context, concepts that modern mental health care recognizes as essential. Treatment was about managing symptoms, not understanding stories. Overcrowding complicated everything further. Asylums originally built to house a few hundred people sometimes held far more as the century progressed. Resources stretched thin. Doctors could not spend much time with each patient. Attendants relied increasingly on standardized methods, applying the same solutions regardless of individual differences. In such conditions, even well-intentioned care could become mechanical. A patient experiencing genuine psychological suffering might receive exactly the same regimen as someone confined for social reasons. There was little flexibility. The institution functioned on efficiency, and efficiency required uniformity. For the individuals inside, this could create a profound sense of invisibility. You were treated according to category rather than personality. Your responses were measured against expectations rather than explored for meaning. Consider the emotional impact of being told repeatedly that compliance would lead to improvement, yet seeing little change in your circumstances. Each treatment promised progress. Each day resembled the last. Hope, initially strong, could begin to fade, and yet it is important to remember that not everyone involved believed they were causing harm. Many physicians sincerely thought they were practicing modern medicine. Compared to earlier centuries, Victorian asylums did represent a shift away from viewing mental illness as purely moral failing or supernatural punishment. There was a genuine attempt, however flawed, to medicalize and manage conditions that had long been feared. But good intentions, when combined with limited understanding and rigid systems, can still produce suffering. The emphasis on order meant that visible calmness was often equated with recovery. A quiet patient was considered improving, even if that quiet resulted from sedation, exhaustion, or resignation. Meanwhile, those who continued to express distress risked further intervention. This dynamic could create a cycle. The more one reacted to the environment, the more treatment was applied to suppress that reaction. The quieter one became, the more one disappeared into the background. Some patients undoubtedly benefited from the structure, rest, and removal from difficult circumstances. Yet others deteriorated, not because of their original condition, but because of the very environment meant to restore them. Modern psychology recognizes the importance of agency, empathy, and individualized care. Victorian treatment rarely incorporated these elements. Instead, it relied on authority and routine, assuming that the professional always knew best. To live under such a system was to surrender not only freedom of movement, but also authority over your own experience. Your feelings were interpreted for you. Your behavior was explained to you. Even your silence could be analyzed as a symptom. Over time, the distinction between treatment and control could become difficult to see from within. Procedures repeated so often that they seemed inevitable, part of the natural order of life in the asylum. Yet beyond the walls, medical knowledge was slowly evolving. New ideas about psychology, neurology, and humane care would eventually emerge, challenging the assumptions that had shaped these institutions. For those living through the earlier era, however, those changes came slowly, if at all. They endured treatments grounded in certainty rather than understanding, in discipline rather than dialogue. And so, within spaces intended to heal, many experienced a strange contradiction. The more the institution tried to correct them, the less they felt recognized as human beings with voices worth hearing. And then, perhaps the most difficult part of all was not the building, nor the routines, nor even the treatments. It was what happened to your place in the world once you were inside. Entry into a Victorian asylum did not simply change where you lived. It altered how society understood you, and how you were allowed to exist within it. The separation was not only physical, it was social, emotional, and, over time, deeply personal. In the beginning, you might assume that your stay would be temporary. You would explain the misunderstanding, demonstrate your stability, and return home. That belief could sustain you through the first days or weeks, giving you something to hold on to as you adjusted to unfamiliar surroundings. But outside the asylum walls, life rarely paused in anticipation of your return. Families had been told that the institution would provide care. Doctors reassured them that professional supervision was necessary. For relatives struggling with uncertainty or exhaustion, this promise could feel like relief. They visited at first, perhaps, navigating the long journey to the hospital grounds, sitting in designated rooms under quiet supervision, unsure what to say or how to behave. Conversations in these visits were often strained. You might try to describe your experiences, to explain how you felt, but your words were filtered through the assumption that you were unwell. Concern replaced trust. Reassurance replaced listening. And then visits sometimes became less frequent. Distance, both physical and emotional, made it easier for families to resume ordinary life without confronting the discomfort of your confinement. Responsibilities filled their days. Time passed. The absence that had once seemed shocking became familiar. Letters might be sent, but correspondence within asylums was not always straightforward. Some institutions monitored or limited communication, believing that certain topics might agitate patients. Replies could be delayed or withheld. A conversation that once would have taken minutes might stretch across months, if it occurred at all. Gradually, the threads connecting you to the outside world thinned. Friends, unsure how to engage with someone now labeled mentally ill, might hesitate to visit. Victorian society carried strong stigma around madness. To associate too closely with someone confined could feel uncomfortable, even risky to one's own reputation. Silence, though painful, became socially easier than confrontation. Inside the asylum, time behaved differently. Without the markers of ordinary life, work, celebrations, changing responsibilities, it could feel as though the world beyond had become distant, almost unreal. News arrived slowly, if at all. Events that shaped society passed by without your participation. You existed in a parallel rhythm, one measured not by seasons of achievement or loss, but by institutional cycles. The longer you remained, the more your identity risked being replaced by the role assigned to you. Records described you in clinical terms: age, behavior, symptoms, progress. These entries accumulated, forming a narrative about you written largely by others. It was possible, over years, for that narrative to overshadow your own memory of yourself. Imagine trying to hold on to who you were before, your habits, ambitions, relationships, while surrounded by an environment that rarely acknowledged those aspects. Without reinforcement, memories could feel fragile, as though they belonged to someone else. Some patients adapted by forming new communities within the asylum. Shared experience created bonds. People talked, worked, and rested alongside one another, building small networks of familiarity in a place designed for regulation rather than companionship. Yet even these connections existed within limits. Transfers between wards, changes in condition, or administrative decisions could separate individuals without warning. Stability was always conditional. Release, when it came, was uncertain. Some patients improved according to the institution's standards and were discharged. But reintegration into society was not simple. Years spent in confinement could leave people unsure how to navigate independence again. Skills might have faded, relationships changed, communities moved on. Others were never released at all. Victorian asylums contained many long-term residents, people who aged within their walls, their lives measured not by external milestones but by decades of institutional living. For them, the asylum became less a temporary refuge and more a permanent environment. When death occurred, it was often quiet, recorded formally, acknowledged briefly. Burials sometimes took place in cemetery grounds attached to the institution, marked by simple stones or numbers. These individuals, once members of families and communities, were remembered primarily within the records of the place that had confined them. The broader public rarely saw these realities. To society at large, asylums remained symbols of progress and care, reassuring structures that handled difficult problems discreetly. Their internal lives were largely hidden from view. This distance allowed comforting assumptions to persist. People believed that those inside were being helped, that confinement was necessary, that professionals understood best. Few questioned how easily someone might be forgotten once removed from daily life. Yet the true impact of the asylum extended beyond its walls. It reflected a cultural struggle to understand difference, vulnerability, and emotional suffering. Faced with behaviors that challenged expectations, society chose separation as a solution. For the individuals inside, that choice shaped every aspect of existence. Over time, hope could change form. Instead of expecting immediate release, some learned to value smaller certainties, a familiar face in the ward, a routine task, a letter that did arrive. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. Even in constrained circumstances, they search for meaning, for connection, for ways to endure. But endurance is not the same as belonging. To be forgotten is not a sudden event. It happens gradually through missed visits, unanswered questions, assumptions made at a distance. The Victorian Asylum, for many, became the place where that gradual forgetting unfolded. Looking back now, these institutions stand as reminders of how easily care can become entangled with exclusion, how fear of what is not understood can lead to systems that protect society at the cost of individuals. They were not simply hospitals, nor solely prisons. They were complex spaces shaped by the beliefs of their time, beliefs about order, normality, and authority. And for those who lived within them, the greatest challenge was not surviving a single day, but navigating the slow transformation of a life once connected to the world into one, lived almost entirely apart from it. Even after understanding the walls, the routines, the treatments, and the isolation, there remained a final, more profound reality: the way life inside a Victorian asylum reshaped the mind, the spirit, and the sense of self. This was the part that few outside could see, and even fewer inside could describe fully. It was not simply the passing of days or the repetition of labor that left a mark. It was the cumulative effect of having every decision about your existence controlled by another, of having your identity defined by those who claimed authority over your mind. Time inside these institutions flowed differently than in the outside world. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Without the usual milestones of family gatherings, work obligations, or social interactions, people lost the markers that allow human consciousness to measure progress and change. Memory became fragile. You could recall events from before admission vividly, yet struggle to distinguish one day from another in the asylum. Even your own thoughts began to feel less solid, less entirely your own. When every action, every movement, every word was observed, interpreted, and often judged, the boundary between your self-perception and the institutional definition of you began to fade. Language itself became a tool of control. Staff, doctors, and visitors used words meant to reassure, but which often carried subtle authority. Compliance is improvement. You will feel better if you follow instructions. This is for your own good. At first, these statements could feel comforting, even protective. But over months or years, their repetition shaped belief. You began to question whether your reactions were truly valid, whether your memories were accurate, whether your sense of right and wrong still mattered. In this way, the asylum didn't just confine the body, it reshaped the mind. Relationships within the asylum followed their own logic. Some patients found companionship with one another, bonds forged in shared suffering and mutual recognition of what the outside world could not see or understand. But these bonds were precarious. The institution could separate friends at any time due to ward transfers, changes in classification, or administrative decisions. Trust had to exist within the narrow limits imposed by the rules of the asylum. Attachments formed under such conditions were often intense but always fragile. They were simultaneously lifelines and reminders of the impermanence of connection. For those who remained long-term residents, the asylum effectively became home. They adapted to its rhythms, internalized its expectations, and came to navigate its corridors and routines with skill. But adaptation was not necessarily comfort. Survival often meant suppressing parts of oneself, desires, expressions, emotions, to fit the institutional template. Individuality became a quiet act of resistance, hidden in subtle gestures, small moments of personal thought, or private memories carefully preserved. In some ways, maintaining a sense of self became the most essential task, yet also the most difficult. Over time, many patients experienced a profound shift in their relationship with freedom. When every action is scheduled, every choice directed, the very concept of autonomy becomes abstract. Some came to fear the world outside, imagining that the structure and predictability of the asylum were safer than the chaos beyond. For others, the loss of freedom became a source of constant anxiety and despair. In either case, the human spirit was forced to negotiate a new reality, one in which the outside world seemed simultaneously distant and essential, a place they could imagine but not access. Death in the asylum carried a quiet, almost administrative inevitability. Patients who spent decades inside often died there, removed from the families they once knew, and buried in unmarked graves or numbered plots. Even for those who left the institution, the experience left lasting scars. Years of confinement altered personalities, eroded confidence, and created emotional habits that could persist for the rest of a lifetime. Reintegration into society was rarely straightforward. Those who returned had to navigate not only the changes in themselves, but also the shifts that had occurred in their families and communities during their absence. People and places had moved on without them. Society at large had little awareness of what life inside the asylum was truly like. Public perception focused on the idea that institutions were places of care, moral guidance, and progressive science. Reports emphasized rehabilitation and treatment, often glossing over the monotony, the coercion, and the psychological impact of prolonged confinement. This gap between perception and reality allowed the institutions to continue operating with limited scrutiny, and it reinforced the stigma that patients carried after their release. Being an ex-patient carried social consequences, fear, suspicion, or pity from others who did not understand the experience, or who assumed that the institution had cured or labeled them accurately. Some survivors of these institutions documented their experiences, though such accounts were rare. When they did, the narratives often emphasized the duality of the asylum, a place where one might find temporary relief from the pressures of life, yet simultaneously a place that could break down the mind with monotony, control, and dehumanization. These first-hand accounts reveal that even the individuals who left physically intact were often mentally and emotionally marked in ways that society could neither measure nor fully appreciate. The asylum experience also highlights the intersection of mental health, social norms, and power. Victorian society believed it could define what constituted a healthy mind and acceptable behavior, and it enforced those definitions through the authority of medical and institutional structures. Those who failed to conform, whether due to genuine illness or simply because they were different, were subjected to a system designed to suppress deviation. In this way, the asylum was as much a social mechanism as it was a medical institution. It reflected the values and fears of the time as much as it addressed the needs of those confined within it. Yet, despite these challenges, the human capacity for resilience persisted. Patients developed strategies to maintain dignity and identity within a constrained environment. Some engaged in quiet creativity, writing, drawing, or composing songs within the limits allowed. Others nurtured friendships, shared stories, and found meaning in small rituals that reaffirmed their personhood. These acts of endurance were subtle but powerful, demonstrating that even in extreme environments, the human spirit seeks connection, expression, and recognition. The story of the Victorian Asylum serves as both historical lesson and cautionary tale. It teaches us about the dangers of defining individuals solely by behaviors that deviate from the norm, without understanding context or humanity. It shows how systems designed to help can inadvertently inflict harm when authority is prioritized over empathy, and routine over individual needs. And it reminds us that isolation, however well-intentioned, has profound consequences for identity, memory, and social belonging. As we reflect on these experiences, we are called to consider the ethical dimensions of care, how society defines normalcy, how it treats difference, and how it structures institutions intended to serve vulnerable populations. The Victorian Asylum is a stark reminder that compassion without understanding, control without connection, and structure without flexibility can transform an environment meant for healing into a crucible of endurance. Ultimately, the legacy of these institutions lives on in the lives of those who were confined, the families who bore witness, and the historical record that documents both innovation and injustice. It challenges us to ask how we, in our own time, balance the needs of individuals with the imperatives of society. It urges us to consider how institutions can be designed not just to manage, but to truly care, not just to observe, but to listen, not just to contain, but to empower. And in this reflection lies the deepest understanding of why you, stepping into the past, would not last a day. Because the Victorian Asylum was not merely a physical place of confinement. It was a space that redefined reality, reshaped perception, and tested the limits of human endurance. To witness it is to confront not only history, but the enduring questions about the human condition, the meaning of freedom, and the responsibilities we bear toward one another in moments of vulnerability.